Good afternoon. This presentation serves to provide an encapsulated view of recent developments in the field of sleep apnea. This paper, titled Toward Standardizing the Protocols for Clinical Validation of Point-of-Care Obstructive Sleep Apnea Diagnosis Devices, will go over a number of key elements for future work in the arena of diagnostic health solutions. The authors for this paper are Vivek Tangudu, Kahkashan Afrin, Sandy Reddy, Nicholas Dutz, Stephen Waltering, and Satish Bukapatnam. Below, in the video description, we'll include a direct link to the publication discussed in today's video. With that, let's proceed with a brief snapshot of what will be covered today in our presentation. First, we want to address the market driver with a high-level overview of the topic, which is point-of-care devices for patients with obstructive sleep apnea. Point-of-care devices have recently arrived to the market as an affordable, accessible, and comfortable solution for diagnosis. Often characterized as wearables, these devices have shown to have incremental growth in the past decade. They come in all shapes and sizes, from actigraphs, portable monitors, to non-contact sensors in the field of obstructive sleep apnea. The market continues to be expanding, with growth rates projected at 10% and approximately $46 billion by 2024. This market driver brings us to a brief abstract of what our paper serves to highlight today. Without getting too deep in the weeds, the purpose of this paper is to unify best practices for testing these aforementioned devices for obstructive sleep apnea. The research approach started with an all-encompassing review of existing literature across various databases, a narrative review of sorts. Our deep, thorough analysis was comprised of various elements that had been seen across methods of validation. To clarify, methods of validation serve to demonstrate how a point-of-care device has appropriately performed to clear FDA regulation. The results are conclusive. There is significant disparity among literature in the field with various elements at play. Following a review of testing and validation methods, we provide a subsequent protocol consisting of specific recommendations for improvement. This necessity of a systematic method is clearly evident after extensive analysis. This brings us to a preliminary agenda of what will be discussed in today's presentation. Phase 1 will establish the foundation for what current issues exist in the field of point-of-care devices for obstructive sleep apnea. Phase 2 further exposes these problems, yet to be solved through a literature review as well as subsequent analysis with graphics, before finally bringing best practices to light. And now, Phase 1 of assessing the current landscape. Starting from the basics, obstructive sleep apnea boils down to interrupted sleep. This stems from obstruction of the airways, as soft tissues in the throat have temporarily relaxed. Sleep apnea can range in severity for each patient, but there is a common theme that takes place: a reduced overall quality of life. In addition to functional impairments and daytime fatigue, it can also result in several long-term health complications if left untreated. Unfortunately, less than 20% of patients have yet to even get diagnosed. This ties back to the central issue of having affordable, accessible, and comfortable options for diagnosis. In the past, polysomnography came with its own respective downsides and failed to be widely available. While polysomnography, or PSG, is still the leading choice for providing the most accurate diagnostic results, point-of-care devices have come to the forefront as optimal solutions for widespread use. And this is the basis for what our paper entails. Point-of-care diagnostics in the realm of obstructive sleep apnea have enormous room for worldwide commercialization and distribution. However, a central tenet in the solution to the problem will involve the FDA. Regulatory bodies must determine whether a proposed device has demonstrated reliable performance when its laboratory results are compared to a gold standard, such as PSG. And in order for the device to be quote-unquote substantially equivalent in the eyes of the FDA, authors would greatly benefit from a protocol suggesting standards for homogeneous reporting. As it currently stands, authors produce varying methods of studying design and data collection procedures, in addition to differing levels of accuracy in their results. Methods of validation, or in other words, testing procedures and metrics for assessing point-of-care devices for obstructive sleep apnea, have yet to be standardized. With our protocol, suggested in Phase 3 of the presentation, authors seeking to validate their respective point-of-care devices would benefit with a homogenized approach. As opposed to an ad hoc approach, this protocol enforces a reproducible standard to ultimately get diagnostic options across the line to approval, resultantly leading to higher accessibility and lower rates of mortality and comorbidity of diseases. Now, Phase 2 will define the exact steps and processes taken to ensure a robust literature review. To first establish a framework for article inclusion and selection, we began exploring various databases with conventional keywords. The terms shown above provided a basis from screening potentially relevant articles for data collection and analysis. After assessing papers by their title, abstract, and content, a number of factors played into the final selection for this review. Out of the 200 plus articles initially screened, only 35 were finally accepted into this review after meeting the conditions specific to comparison with the gold standard, validation in regards to obstructive sleep apnea, and degree of credibility in the form of previous citations made. Following the literature collection process involved disseminating the key elements of each paper's methods of validation. Ultimately, this boiled down to two categories for deeper analysis. Study design proved to be a highly consequential theme for delving into the details of how the authors chose to utilize their device of choice, detailed the background of their subjects, and proceed with the study. Performance assessment, on the other hand, investigates the specifics in which data was chosen to be obtained by the device and how this data compares to a gold standard. Altogether, these elements bring out different features of the paper and provide a systematic process to ensure validity and transparency.
This figure summarizes the key findings of the literature review. For visual representation, we selected 5 major study design elements: the number of subjects, the evaluation metrics, method of quantitative validation, method of qualitative validation, i.e. subject feedback, and the ground truth instrument. The relative size of each bubble within a column reflects the proportion of studies containing the corresponding value. A line connecting bubbles in different columns indicates that at least one paper utilized those two elements. The thicker the line, the more papers had those elements in common. The lines are colored according to the number of subjects in the respective paper, which allows us to easily observe how study designs vary with differing sample sizes. Lastly, yellow bubbles in the ground truth column denote devices on the market, while gray bubbles denote devices that are not publicly available. Studies most commonly used 51 to 75 subjects. Studies with greater than 50 subjects used a wider variety of evaluation metrics and validation techniques than did studies with 50 or fewer subjects. Notably, studies with fewer than 25 subjects used the same two metrics and very rarely gathered subject feedback. Some other significant trends are the heterogeneity of quantitative validation techniques and subject feedback. These two elements have roughly equal distribution among their categories and do not show much correlation with the other 3 elements. The final observation we would like to highlight is the almost even split between public and proprietary ground truth instruments.
Finally, Phase 3 provides an overarching protocol and recommendations for future work. As seen in the previous graphic, are in-depth data collection procedures suggest a lack of conformity throughout all elements of a device validation paper. Some of this can be attributed to the inherent differences in the design of the devices being tested, but our protocol distills universal best practices in addition to potential recommendations for consideration. Now, on to our analysis. A key factor for device implementation in any study is a flexibility for said device to function in a home environment. While this setting is improbable for a select few subgroups, point-of-care devices ultimately meet a market need through the possibility to diagnose anywhere. It is also pertinent to list the device components in use for the sake of transparency in the process. Demographic data was seen to be widely ranging in detail, as the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, or ESS, was only reported in less than 40% of literature. However, the ESS specifically touches upon the fact that subjects should undergo exclusionary criteria for acceptance in a study. Other recommendations include placing restrictions on smoking and drinking prior to testing, providing as much data on patients as possible, and including a large number of subjects, as suggested by the World Health Organization. The prior infographic suggests that papers have frequently contained more than 50 subjects and tend to use more metrics and techniques for validation as well. The data collection procedures specify the methods in which subjects undergo observation and subsequent analysis, making it all the more important for standardization. We recommend taking a number of measures to eliminate potential bias, such as including a group of subjects strictly in a home setting, specifying prime subject demographics that meet optimal performance of the device, and containing at least one blinded technician recording. Moving forward in our protocol, we list some key factors to consider, as performance assessment plays a large part in the success of any validation paper. It is important to acknowledge the potential shortcomings from using a wearable device such as activity monitors, which have a limited number of channels. While diagnostic results can ultimately prove to be verifiable, activity monitors or actigraphs have shown to inadequately detect wake when they only measure body movement through an accelerometer. This raises a crucial point to consider improving means of data collection by an additional number of channels with a microphone or a nasal cannula. From a metrics perspective, papers should continue to tag along the theme of standardized practices when it comes to measuring sleep with specific indices. Apnea-hypopnea index, AHI, and respiratory disturbance index, RDI, are the primary outcome variables to determine severity of sleep-disordered breathing from a patient. Metrics such as total sleep time, wake after sleep onset, and rapid eye movement primarily detect sleep, and wake, and should also be considered. Aside from conventional means of manual scoring, point-of-care devices also generate metrics with widely varying methods of automated scoring. While it may be acceptable if certain popular analyses are not elaborated upon, less common approaches warrant a much more rigorous explanation and will increase transparency. Moving on to consolidated standards for the gold standard, we recommend using polysomnography, or PSG. This is simply due to the fact that it produces the most comprehensive diagnoses to compare with. Point-of-care devices that post comparable results to a well-known PSG system receive considerably more attention, so it would also be in the interest of the authors to specify the system or software being used. Now, qualitative and quantitative validation can arguably be taken as the most significant factors to assess a device's overall efficacy. Qualitative validation essentially serves a basis of measuring a patient's personal comfort with wearing a device. As a result, we recommend including post-lab questionnaires to set a standard of assessing how a device's ergonomic design impacts the overall experience. Now, quantitative validation methods are taken to compare the strength of diagnoses from subjects undergoing both PSG and the point of contact devices during a study. Methods of validation can range from Cohen's kappa coefficient to an ANOVA test, while correlation and Bland-Altman plots have shown to be used in over 80% of work reported in the literature. Sensitivity and specificity should be further implemented to validate quality in terms of true wake and sleep states. The receiver operating characteristic, or ROC curve, is also recommended to demonstrate viable evidence for distinguishing between true and false positives and finding the optimal AHI cutoff. As far as statistical tests are concerned, our graphic in the next slide provides the best representation for the sheer number of possibilities available. This graphic captures an essential point of what our paper aims to do. It can be noted that statistical tests such as ANOVA, t-test, and chi-squared were the most frequently applied methods of analyzing data between a point-of-care device and the gold standard. On the right, apnea-hypopnea index, oxygen desaturation index, and respiratory disturbance index were primarily metrics for comparison among point-of-care devices such as portable monitors. But on the left, the other sleep stage-related metrics were primarily used for comparison among devices such as actigraphs and non-contact sensors. The variance in statistical tests are wide-ranging in use, just as its metrics are. And this graphic helps portray that there are a number of options available to take. On the contrary, this graphic helps illustrate that it would be beneficial to utilize more than one statistical test to remove bias or possibility for misleading agreement. Finally, our rating system was created with the intention of highlighting particular recommendations and rewarding articles that strive to include many of the elements discussed from today's presentation. While a score of 1 represents the bare minimum for papers to include certain features, a score of 3 would show that a paper has met or even exceeded expectations. The authors acknowledge that it might not be in their best interest for certain devices to follow our rating scale, so we simply seek to raise a simple question. Has your validation paper followed recommendations to the best extent possible? After all, this protocol serves to call out the most critical discrepancies in the literature and establish standardized practices for future work. To wrap this up, there currently is a push towards using wearable technologies for sleep testing and diagnostics. This paper has distilled the various best practices from the disparate publications featuring human subject testing for sleep. By following the protocol effectively, devices would end up having stronger quality of diagnoses and studies would be designed more methodically. Altogether, this streamlined approach will improve the quality of future point-of-care devices for obstructive sleep apnea and provide efficient structure of future literature in the field. If you would be further interested as to the details of this presentation today, please find a link to our full text publication in the description below. Thank you for watching.